Welcome, it is Mitch. I am on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. NFL trade deadline day, the Packers make a move. It's a subtraction from the roster, not an addition, trading pass rusher Preston Smith to the Pittsburgh Steelers. The compensation returning to Green Bay is a 7th-round pick in the 2025 NFL Draft. There's two ways to really look at this. You can look at it through one prism and say Preston Smith has 2.5 sacks so far this year. He's 31 years old, so he's on, the wrong side of his career. If you look at, trajectory age-wise, he's not exactly in the prime of his career anymore. He's got 2 years left on his current deal. If he was in Green Bay, and they weren't exactly cheap years financially for the Packers to work with, and so you send him on to Pittsburgh, you get back a 7th-round pick, and some people might look at it from the financial perspective, the long-term picture, and thinking 2 more years left on the deal for a guy who's 31 years old, not really producing this year. It makes sense for Green Bay. The other side of the coin would look at the now. They would look at this team currently 6-3 at the bye week, and they would say, I don't really care about, the financial responsibilities for the Packers next year and the year after that. There are many Packer fans that would look at this and say, I'm worried about getting better right now and trying to make a run at a Super Bowl. After a loss to the Lions, Detroit looks like the cream of the crop in the NFC, but it's not a far enough reach that Green Bay should feel like they have no shot. It's not anything close to that. Green Bay could still make a run through the postseason, through the NFC, and be the representative for the conference in New Orleans come February. But you're looking around the landscape, and Detroit added a pass rusher, and Zadarius Smith, a very familiar name for Packer fans, and there's other teams wheeling and dealing out there too, and Green Bay instead goes with a subtraction to the roster instead of an addition. Let's look at this through a couple of different perspectives. For me, the on-the-field production for Preston Smith was not great this year. It just wasn't. But if you look at the landscape of the pass rushing department for Green Bay, it's been pretty miserable. They are struggling to get pressure on the opposing quarterback. They are really struggling to get all the way home and register sacks, and it's not just a Preston Smith issue. We're seeing it with Rashawn Gary. We're seeing it with Lucas Van Ness. We're seeing it from Kingsley Enagbare. The pass rushing unit as a whole for Green Bay has struggled mightily. Why then would you trade someone who could be a potential solution in some capacity? Do I think if Preston Smith stayed in Green Bay, he was going to have a second half of the season where he burst onto the scene, drank from the fountain of youth, and had 7 or 8 sacks? No, but I think when you're really digging deep to try to find any possible answer for a pass rush that's struggling as largely as Green Bay has, trading away one of those options to me doesn't make sense. And I get he hasn't been productive. I get he's on the wrong side of 30 for his career, right? He's 31 years old, 2 big years left on his contract. I get the financial ramifications that this held for Green Bay and that it would make sense to trade him from that perspective. But you now have one less option, and I keep looking over here because I have Twitter pulled up because I'm just waiting to see if Green Bay, if there's some sort of corresponding move. Are they going to add a cornerback? Are they going to add an edge rusher, a pass rusher? I don't know, but the 7th rounder, the compensation for Preston doesn't upset me. I didn't expect him to get much for a guy who hasn't, quite frankly, done that much this year on the field, but it's an addition for the Steelers. It's the fact that right now you're really scratching and clawing to find anyone who can step up to the plate and deliver and get pressure on the opposing quarterback, and now you're down one more of those potential options trading away Preston Smith. The secondary part of it that, and I'm not angry that the Packers traded Preston Smith, but I do think most people are viewing this as like, oh, it's not a big deal. They traded Preston Smith, don't have the 2 years left on the contract. There's a dead cap hit, obviously, for those years. And, hey, they got something back. They got a 7th-round pick. I'm not, furious, punching the clouds or anything like that. But I do think this has a huge hit in the locker room, too. Preston Smith, veteran leader, lunch pail to work kind of guy. And I know that's kind of a throwaway line, but this dude, did we ever have any off-the-field issues? Did you ever hear about anything within the locker room where it's like, oh, Preston Smith's upset about his role, he's upset about his usage, things of that nature? We never did. And if you look at the last few weeks, his usage, his snap count totals, percentage-wise, have gone down each and every week. I think the last 4 weeks for Preston Smith. So it was a guy who, within Jeff Hafley's defense, was starting to be used less and less and less, but he never complained. I think Packers players will look at this trade and say, man, it's not this team selling at the deadline, but it's giving away a veteran leader for, the compensation you got in return. If you put aside the financial part of it, it's next to nothing. It's a 7th-round pick. I think isn't that what Green Bay traded when they got Malik Willis, and now they just get a 7th-rounder back from Pittsburgh. So I hope the roster and the team isn't looking around like, whoa, we just traded one of the voices in this locker room that everyone can sort of agree unanimously is a voice that unites and keeps everything in check and everything in line for this group for Green Bay, and he's been there. I mean, you remember Preston Smith came in the same year as Zadarius Smith, part of the same free agent class for Green Bay, and it seems like Zadarius Smith has been gone for like 5 years now, but it just goes to show that it feels like Preston Smith has been a big part of Packers defenses for years now, and so I think the locker room aspect of this, the leadership part, takes a hit too, and I do value that. I think that matters. This seems like a very cohesive group for the Packers, a very motivated group, a group that really has, as a whole, a good head on its shoulders, and I hope that this trade doesn't send a little bit of a shockwave where it's like, oh, what's the plan here? And I get Goody in the front office. They can't just look at this year. They have to look 2 years, 3 years down the road. I just don't like it from the perspective of, yes, he wasn't having a great year, but he could have contributed something in an area of massive need for the Packers right now, and that is the inability they've shown to get home to the quarterback. And then secondarily, the little knock it could take to the locker room. I don't know. I'm not upset. I'm not up in arms about it, but there were, I think it was Ian Rappaport of NFL Network a few weeks ago had a story that mentioned teams were checking in with the Packers on Andre Dillard and Preston Smith, and I put out a video and I said, if they trade Andre Dillard, I'm fine with it for one big reason. If the Packers are at any point this year, no disrespect to Dillard, but if Green Bay's ever in a spot this season where Andre Dillard's starting on a week-in, week-out basis, you're probably in trouble anyways, because you're talking about, numerous hits to the offensive line if you're getting to a point where Andre Dillard is a cemented-in starter. The reason I didn't like the idea of trading Preston Smith is because, offensive line's been, I think, pretty good. The penalties are a huge issue, but pass protection, run blocking, it's been good, I would say, for the most part for Green Bay. If you get to a point where Dillard is playing heavy snaps for you, you're probably in trouble already. With Preston, it's a different story. Yes, the snap count numbers have dwindled the last few weeks, but it's a guy that we've just seen deliver in spots throughout the years, and you hoped that he could find that again at some point in time because, again, the pass rush issues for Green Bay are not something that anyone was looking at and saying, oh, this is a Preston Smith thing, like he's underwhelmed this year. He had for Green Bay, and I hope he finds it in Pittsburgh and maybe is a better fit in their scheme. But I'm looking at Rashawn Gary, Kingsley Enagbari, Lucas Van Ness. Like, those guys are struggling too. Like, Lucas Van Ness, I know he was a first-round pick over a year ago. There's no one that can argue that Van Ness has made a forward leap in year two compared to year one. Like, his playing time as a rookie wasn't great, and we saw Green Bay kind of take a similar approach with Rashawn Gary. I believe they drafted Rashawn Gary the same offseason they signed Zadarius Smith and Preston Smith. And so you would have hoped in year two that 1 year under his belt, there weren't huge expectations or a lot put on the plate of Lucas Van Ness last year, that this year we would have seen more. And there's time. There's a little less than half of the regular season to go. But Lucas Van Ness has been invisible for a lot of games this year. I thought Kingsley Enagbari the first few weeks was the most consistent pass rusher for Green Bay. Outside of, if you look at the interior defensive line, Devontae Wyatt was hands down the best at getting home to the quarterback for Green Bay. But on the perimeter of that defensive line, I thought it was Enagbari, and then he really filtered down, and the production tapered off for him as well. And Rashawn Gary, I love Rashawn Gary, the guy. I love Rashawn Gary, the player, but he has been woefully disappointing this year. So much so that people started bringing up and I think I felt prisoner to this once. It was like one game a couple weeks ago where Rashawn Gary had like 5 or 6 quarterback pressures, and we were celebrating that. Like him not even getting home for a sack, but we're like, hey, he had X amount of quarterback pressures in this game. Like, that's a sign in the right direction. But then you kind of sit back and you're like, has this pass rush been so bad that we're celebrating quarterback pressures? It's pretty alarming. So I think for this year, for the right now, obviously doesn't help Green Bay because you're trading away. Obviously, there's varying degrees to using this word, but you're trading away an asset that could have helped you at some point, a veteran leader and a big voice, I think, in that locker room, as far as a voice that if Preston Smith is speaking up, people are paying attention and listening and respecting what he has to say. And so you lose that. And I do think that matters because I think it could have a ripple effect down to the roster where guys are looking around like, man, we're trying to make this push at 6-3, but we're trading away someone. And it's again why I just keep refreshing Twitter, hoping that before the deadline pops up that Green Bay maybe makes another move at corner. I know Marshawn Lattimore went to Washington. And look, the trade deadline for Green Bay historically is not something where they're adding pieces left and right and going crazy. It's just not really the Packers' way. It's draft and develop. And we saw that with Ted Thompson. We're seeing that with Goody as well, although he'll dip his toes into the waters in the trade market a little bit more at the deadline. We saw it last year. I know people are going to bring up last season and say, hey, you know what? Last year the Packers traded Rasul Douglas to Buffalo, rallied anyways, made a playoff run, so on and so forth. When they traded Rasul Douglas last year, they were 3-6 coming off a loss at home to Minnesota 24-10, where the offense looked lifeless, the defense looked less than interested, and I think many people were looking around thinking Green Bay is 3-6. They just traded Rasul Douglas in a cornerback room that was pretty banged up, pretty battered with injuries at the time, and a lot of people looked at that trade like, yeah, it's just not going to be the year for Green Bay. This is a situation where Green Bay's 6-3. You're flip-flopping the wins and the losses. Yes, they just had a very frustrating, irritating, annoying loss to Detroit, but no one's looking around at Green Bay like, this just ain't going to be the year. Like, this could still be a very special year for the Packers, and now you trade away a guy who could have been an answer at, if you look around the depth chart for Green Bay, what are your biggest worries right now? What are your biggest worries and your biggest question marks? To me, it's looking at the corner spot because Jair's missed a lot of time the last couple of years, and he's awesome when he's on the field, but sometimes the best ability is availability, and he's had more than just one or two injuries pop up. Didn't play against Detroit this past Sunday, and I think besides the corner spot, the glaring thing is the lack of pass rush. But the name recognition is there. That's why it's so frustrating, because there are names there like Rashawn Gary, where we've seen have monster years, and he's a former first-round pick, and used another first-round pick on Lucas Van Ness. And Enagbari's been good at times, but you would hope there's something else on the docket. Otherwise, what is it? It's Green Bay now going to say, well, the pass rush has been miserable. We just traded away one of those guys, didn't add, and we're going to hope that it's the trio that I've mentioned, Gary, Enagbari, and Van Ness, and like Brenton Cox Jr. Like, is that going to be the next guy up in line that you hope does something for the defensive edge for Green Bay? I don't know. So I'm not up in arms mad about the trade. To me, it's just kind of it's a little bit of an annoyance because you're trading away at a spot where you need help, and Preston hasn't really delivered that, but neither has anyone else this year on a consistent basis. And I hope it doesn't send like the wrong note or the wrong message to the locker room, because this is very much so a team that can still make some noise in the NFC despite what we saw on Sunday against Detroit. Maybe it's a sign that Green Bay isn't done. Maybe I post this video and 15, 20 minutes from now, Green Bay makes a trade for an edge rusher or adds to the cornerback room. I'm not sure. So I get the financial perspective of this. 31 years old. Snap counts dwindling this year, going down, going in the wrong direction for Preston Smith, and the production hasn't been there, and it'll help, free up some stuff for the next couple seasons, even though there's going to be a dead cap hit. But for the now, it's not a huge loss for the Packers, but it's somewhat of a head scratcher because it doesn't help the pass rushing area at all. If anything, it weakens it for Green Bay, because now you're going deeper into the depth chart, hoping that someone else can step up and fill the spot in the void that's left by Preston Smith. So the Packers trade the veteran Preston Smith to the Pittsburgh Steelers for a 7th rounder. I'll refresh one more time, but yeah, not seeing anything on the Packers making news outside of that trade before the 3 p.m. deadline. So we'll see. There's at the time of me recording this, there's an hour left to go. So we'll see. Preston Smith gone, though. Packers make a move. Wheeling and dealing, getting involved in the mix right before the deadline comes and goes. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.